How's it going, guys? I'm Jeff, and welcome back to the Real Life Podcast. As you can see right now, my lovely wife, Alyssa, is not here. You can call it maternity leave, even though she's in the other room, but when you work from home, that's kind of how it works, I guess. You guys know we just had a baby, and so she's obviously taken just a few weeks off from the podcast, but we do have a special guest today, and that is a new friend of mine that we're just now talking right now, but a person who I've actually read, enjoyed from afar for a long time, fresh thinker, brilliant thinker, amazing author, and that is James Clear. James, how you doing?
Hey, good to talk to you, man. Thanks so much for having me, and congrats on the baby.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's number 3, so we're just stacking them in there. We're halfway to our goal. No, I'm joking. I don't know if we'll go that big. But no, super honored for you to be on the podcast. For those who don't know, the listeners listening right now, James, I mean, I don't know if what I like doing is I like saying what I think who you are, and then I'd love to hear how you say that. So
Sure.
From afar, I feel like you are a habit ninja sensei expert. You are a brilliant writer and thinker. One thing I love about you, and I've been following you for a bit now, subscribe to your newsletter, is I feel like you're singular in thought. And what I mean by that is I read a lot, I'm online a lot, I'm a writer myself, and I feel like I look for guys and I look for women and I look for people who kind of are, I think, bringing a fresh perspective to their domain. And I feel like specifically with habits, I think you are doing that. And there's actually a couple questions that I have in a minute that I think you'll see why I think you're doing such an amazing job on that and why I think you're unique. And I'd love to hear why you think that. But yeah, how would you kind of introduce yourself to the people?
Oh, well, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, easy way to describe it is I've been writing about habits, behavior change, and continuous improvement for about, let's see, 6 years now. And then most recently, I spent the last 3 years writing this new book called Atomic Habits, and that came out in October of 2018. And it's sort of the culmination of like all the thinking that I've done on habits and behavior change. And I wanted to synthesize the fundamentals of the ideas, but also do what you just mentioned, which is try to bring a fresh perspective to the topic of habits, which is something that's challenging because it's been written about, many times for a long period of time. But I think that it's central to our daily life and was definitely worth the effort. And I'm really happy with how it all turned out.
Totally. And I think one thing that I think of, and I think why I am excited to have you on, is probably a couple months ago, we kind of rebranded the podcast and kind of did a couple changes. And one of the most popular episodes since we've done that was one where, like I said, I read, I'm always thinking, so I kind of bring that to the podcast. I'm always trying to percolate and bring it to the audience. And one of the ones that I didn't think people were going to enjoy that most, but which they did, was we talked about, I kind of did a whole episode, me and Alyssa, on what I think we titled it, the dark side of the life hacking productivity culture, And there's so many blessings to that, obviously, right? But I do think there's come a point where some of that stuff has a dark side, right? Where I think, first of all, a lot of those things that you see out there with the life hacking, and I would put I would put habit culture in here, not habits, but I would say sometimes daily habits, daily rituals, daily regimens have kind of gotten dragged over here, where I just think, there's a couple things I think on a dark side of it. I think it kind of cheats the system. It's saying, no, I'm not actually content with who I am, and I don't want to just let the work be the work. And so we kind of want to hack our way to a better way. And I think it kind of almost has this underlying aspect of like, man, we believe we can kind of be superhuman, right? If we just tweak our lives enough, then just our life will be the best thing in the world. So I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because I feel like when I'm reading your book, which, by the way, for those that are watching on Facebook and YouTube, Atomic Habits was the book he was talking about. Incredible book. I'm almost done with it. New York Times bestseller, and it's a brilliant book. And I think you say on an interview you were at like 700 or 800 pages and got it down to 250.
Yeah.
Which that's like crazy, and that's like the opposite of most author problems, right? Most of us have to bloat books because there's a manuscript word count that people don't realize you have to hit. But yeah, so maybe talk about that. Is that like, do you kind of see that too? Have you? And I feel like you've carved a unique space, not going against that, but just offering a fresh perspective that's not that.
Yeah, well, so I think certainly there's something there. There's like a thread to pull on. So, the last chapter in Atomic Habits is called The Downside of Good Habits. I mean, and so I'm definitely, I share some of your thoughts on this. But I think also from a high level, a lot of what you're talking about with this like hacker-oriented culture or life hacks and this like total human optimization kind of idea is there's kind of this implicit assumption that underlies that, which is if I can just get to X, then I'll be happy. or if I can just, have everything dialed in to the perfect degree, then we'll be there. And I think I talk about this early on in the book, this idea, the difference between systems and goals. And I think that is kind of at the heart of this conversation as well, which is that if you're focused, we live in a culture that is very results oriented. So, take the news, for example. You're never going to see a news story that is something like, man eats chicken and salad for lunch. It's always going to be like 6 months later, man loses 70 pounds, right? Like that is the story. It's never it's true. The results are highly visible and talked about, and the process is invisible and hidden from view. And this is just magnified by social media because now we're seeing everybody's results all day long on Instagram and Facebook and so on. And I think because we are inundated with results so much, with pictures of highlights, with the event or the outcome, we tend to think that what we need is the outcome, that like that's the thing that needs to change. And this life hack oriented culture is very much tied to that. It's like, okay, the thing I need to get is this outcome. So let me try to figure out the shortest possible path to get that. Or let me try to figure out this little hack or routine that lets me just get the outcome with as little work as possible. And there's a balance here because, it doesn't make sense to waste time and energy and effort, right? None of us want to do that. So it's not that pursuing a more effective thing is bad in principle. But the strategy of let me make it all about the result or the outcome, I think is misguided. And the example that I give for this a lot of the time is imagine that you have like a messy room or a cluttered garage or something, and you set a goal to have a clean room. You think that what needs to change is the result or the outcome. You think that what needs to change is I need a clean room. And so you get motivated for 2 or 3 hours and you figure out how to do that, or you take some life hack strategy and find like a new app like Uber for cleaning and hire that and get them to come in and do it all or whatever. And at the end of it all, 2 or 3 hours later, you have a clean room. But if you don't change the sloppy, messy, pack rat habits that led to a dirty room in the first place, then you turn around a month later and you have a messy room again. And so we think that the results are the thing that needs to change, but they're not. The thing that actually needs to change are the habits behind the result. It's the system behind the outcome that we should be focused on. And I think that once you realize that, once you conceptualize that, you can maintain your ambition to get the outcomes that you want, but you shift your focus from trying to avoid the work, which is this life hack strategy, to mastering the work and mastering the art of showing up and making sure you like build these habits and routines and systems each day. And that I think is like the more accurate approach.
I love that. And I'm looking in your, one of my favorite quotes. I'm trying to see where it was. I've just been thinking about it since I read. Oh, here it is right here. You do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. I feel like that's brilliant. I feel like that's not talked about in this space. And it's funny what you just said there about the systems and the goals. That was where I think I read something from you. That was, I think, my first point of contact with you was a couple years ago, maybe. You had written so basically a couple years ago, me and my wife went on a journey where I kind of started sensing the same things in our own certain way. And I don't know how much you know about or how much you kind of have backtracked on me and Alyssa, but we're definitely coming from like a faith perspective. And so I was kind of looking at it from that, spiritual formations and kind of some problems I see in religion, etc. And it was really interesting because basically we just gave up goals. I think it was like 2016, or we just said like that's like that whole yearly thing. You just go hard, you do it like, well, and I'm a whiteboard guy, so I love getting out the whiteboard December 31st and doing all that. And I just was like, I'm good. Like, I don't know. I just reached this point where I was like, well, I'm good. And what we said, we kind of traded it in. We didn't just say no to goals. We traded in for what we call formations, right? Which in the faith perspective is almost identical to systems. And what's funny is I remember writing like a napkin drawing where it was like a linear line, which that's goals, right? Like it's about going a direction with a finish line, like with a line, and then kind of more of a circle with a line where you're kind of a system is creating that. And it's been so beneficial for us the last couple of years of not only taking off burden and weight, but what's funny is we still have accomplished exactly what we wanted to accomplish, right? But it's just at the level of about concentrating on who we want to be, not what we want to do, right? Like when I turn 80, I don't want to look back and say, man, I met all my goals. I want to say I'm the person I wanted to be, and I probably still will accomplish the goals. So I don't know if you even wanted to talk about that a second, because it was funny. I think that's where I found you, was I was kind of on that train, and then I was researching, and then I came across a blog of yours that kind of had, it was funny, you almost did like napkin drawings too, but you had, I think, had a bullseye I think, and then maybe like something else. And it was like, and you called it systems goals, I think. So maybe talk about that just for one more minute.
Yeah. So the question
or the complexity of it, like
here,
do you set goals? Do you not? How do you kind of still walk in the nuance?
Yeah, okay. So I think there are two things to talk about. So first is this question about setting goals and so on. And the second one's more about like identity and becoming the kind of person that you want to be.
Yeah.
So the first question, I similar to you, like hey, this is coming from someone who set goals for a very long time, right? Like I would make goals for the weight I wanted to lift in the gym, for how well I wanted my business to do, for the grades I wanted to get in school, like all kinds of things. And at some point, I looked back and realized, well, I made all these goals and I could literally look at them on paper or on a spreadsheet or whatever. And some of them I achieved and a lot of them I didn't. So obviously, setting the goal was not the thing that determined whether or not I made progress. And you see this a lot that in any particular domain, the people who are the winners and the losers, so to speak, in that particular area, they often have the same goals, right? Like every candidate who applies for a job has the goal of getting the job. Every Olympian has the goal of winning the gold medal. But if the winners and the losers have the same goal, then the goal cannot be the thing that makes the difference in their performance. Now, it might be necessary, but it's not sufficient. And this is kind of where I fall on goal setting and this idea of systems or formations or things like that, which is that goals are very useful for setting a sense of direction, for developing clarity around where you should focus. It helps you understand where your attention should be directed.
That's good.
But that action is actually fairly quick and the goal can be pretty much put on a shelf after that, once you know what direction you're moving in. And instead, like 95% of your time should be spent not thinking about the goal or the outcome or the result, but focusing on the system. And Bill Walsh, who's a famous football coach, he won 3 Super Bowls. He has a saying where he says the score will take care of itself. And this is the same, like in any sport, the goal is to have the best score on the scoreboard at the end of the game. But if you spent the entire game looking at the scoreboard, thinking about the goal, it would never work. You would lose every game. And so the question that I had was like, well, let's say you're a basketball coach. You know your goal is to win the championship. But what if you just didn't talk about that at all, didn't think about it? You focused only on your system, on how you recruited assistant coaches and players, what you did at practice each day, how they recovered from training, what kind of film study you do, all that stuff. Could you or would you still achieve your goal? And I think often what you see is the teams that do the best job of that are the ones who end up getting the results, which kind of comes back to your example of these formations that you were focusing on. It's like, well, once we focused on that, then we ended up getting the results came naturally. And so I think that sometimes when people hear things like forget about goals, focus on systems, and some of this other stuff that I've written, they think like, oh, that sounds kind of weird. Are you saying like I shouldn't be ambitious or I shouldn't be, trying to achieve these things? And the answer is no. The answer is just that you're focusing your ambition in a different direction. Rather than focusing your attention on the scoreboard, you're more focused on the practice. And I think that ends up being a much more fruitful way to spend your energy and attention and time because it ultimately leads to results anyway.
I like that. It's kind of like, I've never thought about, I like how you kind of said, still set them, but just put it on a shelf. It's almost like kind of like, you got to, like, it's like Google Maps when you're driving. Like, you got to put in the address right when you get in the driveway, but then I never think about it again, in the sense of like, oh, it's just kind of talking to me, but I don't like go actively back into Google Maps on the whole drive, right?
Yeah, 95% of your attention is like driving down the street, performing the system of driving, right? Like focusing on the actual journey.
That's really good.
The goal is there to provide a little clarity.
I really like that picture a lot. That's a really good point. And it's supposed to feed the system rather than the other way around. I think we're almost like goal drunk, right? Of just like that's the thing that's going to give us the meaning or the value. And let's talk about what you were just going to say too, which was one of my favorite parts of your book, is where it's actually in the beginning too. So for those who get the book, it's in like I think first or second chapter. You talk about identity basically and how that plays a role in goals, and that's one of my favorite parts about your work. I don't know if you're familiar with James K.A. Smith. He's a philosopher, professor, I think in Michigan at a university, and he's done some work on habits, but from the philosophical kind of like high insane level, which not many philosophers talk about habits. But he takes it there. He basically says that he kind of says like your habits are showing you who you are, and then kind of like what you talk about, where you can go into who you are. And then on top of that, he talks about it's really about affection of your heart, like love. What you love will kind of create your habits for you. And so you have to really make sure, like, what are you giving your attention to, your allegiance to? Is it the phone? Is it this? It's et cetera. And so, but I love how you kind of break that down. So talk about how you talk about maybe the difference between identity and it's all that.
So if you buy this idea that systems are more important than goals, or systems that are how we make progress and move forward, then the natural next question is like, well, what does that mean? Like, how am I supposed to design a system, or what should that be organized toward, or, what does that look like? And I think the answer comes back to this idea of identity. So first of all, let me talk about how identity and habits connect. And this comes back a little bit to what you just mentioned, which is this idea that habits are how you embody a particular identity. So every morning that you make your bed, you embody the identity of someone who is clean and organized. Or whenever you go to the gym, you embody the identity of someone who is fit. Or each time you write one sentence, you embody the identity of someone who is a writer. And so in a sense, it's kind of like each action you take is a vote for the kind of person that you believe that you are, or the person that you want to become. And at first, all experiences in life are casting these little votes and informing your kind of sense of self, or telling you more about who you are and what's important to you. But because habits are repeated so much, because they're these daily routines and they're casting votes day in and day out, they accumulate the bulk of the evidence, the bulk of the proof for who you are and what's important to you. And so as you repeat these habits, you build up this little mountain of votes, this little mountain of evidence. And eventually you start to believe something about yourself, So like, you could say, man, I've meditated 12 of the last 14 days. Like, maybe I'm a meditator now. Or you go to soccer practice and you kick a soccer ball around. And if you do it once, you don't believe I'm a soccer player. But if you show up every afternoon and you do that for 6 months or 9 months or a year, you turn around at some point and you're like, I guess I'm a soccer player now. And so this, I think, is kind of this iterative way that identity is shaped and formed through our habits. And you mentioned that when you're 80 years old and on your deathbed, you get to the end of your life, you're not focused on the goals that you achieve. You're focused on, did I become the type of person I want to become? And I think that the key here is that the best lever we have, the best approach we have for doing that, for proving to ourselves that we are the kind of person we want to become, is by building these small habits that cast votes for that desired identity, by reinforcing that I'm that type of person. And if you can do that, then you actually have proof that that's who you are. Yeah. And that counts for a lot. Like, this is where I think my method differs a little bit from sayings like fake it till you make it, which there's nothing necessarily wrong with fake it till you make it, with like believing something that you don't have evidence for. But it's not a good long-term strategy, because we have a word for beliefs that don't have evidence, and we call it delusion, right? Like, at some point, your brain doesn't like this conflict where you're like, well, I keep telling myself that I'm this kind of person, but then my actions don't match up. And this is why I think small habits are so important, and perhaps really the ultimate reason that they're meaningful. We talk about habits because they provide these external results, like habits can help you be more productive or make more money or lose weight or reduce stress. And it's true, habits can do all those things, which is great. But habits do not only provide external results, they're also the path through which you reinforce your internal identity, your sense of self-image. And that, I think, is the ultimate reason they matter so much, is that they're like the best lever we have to pull for reshaping that sense of self-image. And if you can do that just by building small habits, then eventually you can shape how you think about yourself. This is why something like doing 5 push-ups, it just sounds like it's not that meaningful. People are like, well, why would I do 5 push-ups a day? That's not going to get me ripped. That's not going to get me in shape. But on days when, like, say you've been traveling across country and you're tired, you were on the plane for 4 hours, you get to the hotel, all you can do is 5 push-ups, and then you collapse on the bed and go to sleep. But at least you're the type of person who doesn't miss workouts. And so even though it's small and it doesn't change you in a physical way, it still reinforces that desired identity. It still casts a vote for being a fit person. And that, I think, is one of the paradoxical things about small habits, is that even on days when they don't deliver the external results you want, they can still deliver that internal result. They can still reinforce being the kind of person you want to be. And that makes them meaningful. And if they're meaningful, they're actually not small at all. They're actually big. And so I think that that's how I think about the connection between identity and habit.
I love that. And I feel like that's where you're really fresh and unique and where we don't hear enough of on this conversation. Because to me, that feels like the gasoline. If you can get that part of it, that's what can keep the tank full. That's what you can actually keep driving. You're not just kind of running on empty, trying to be about habits. And like I said, life hack your life, et cetera. I feel like if you can get deeper down to the core of who am the person I want to become and who am I? And it's funny. I feel like it kind of goes on the negative side too, maybe and I've been thinking, it was funny, I've been in this personal journey this year, and I was reminded of it when you were just talking, but also in the book, where how you can almost reinforce your identity in a negative way, right? like, and you kind of self-inflicted wound. Like, so for me, I was like, I'm never a morning person. That was my thing. I'm like, I'm not a morning person. I never get up early and blah, blah, blah. And I never set my alarm. And what's funny is that starts feeding and getting into a very hardened, like crusty way of like, man, that's going to be hard to break out of. But it is interesting too, how sometimes you can get lucky with necessity. And so what I mean by that is like, I just said that my whole life until I started having kids, right? And then you're like, okay, I still never said I was a morning person, but all of a sudden I have work to do. They're toddlers, they get up a little later. So like, okay, if I want to be efficient with my writing, I'm at most clear at 5 and 6 a.m. Like I just have to do the work. I never even said I was a morning person. I just set my alarm, I start doing the work. And then all of a sudden, and so now I wake up at 5 a.m. and a year later, I kind of look back, I'm like, oh, am I a morning person? I mean, I guess anyone who wakes up at 5 a.m. every day is probably a morning person, And so I think there's sometimes out of necessity, but it's funny because I was reinforcing it in a bad way, but then I was just being faithful to the work that then reinforced it. It's like it gets momentum. Like now I can't not wake up. Do you know what I mean?
Well, that's a great example of this concept that I'm talking about, this idea that your habits cast votes or provide evidence for who you believe that you are. Like now you're a year in and you're like, well, now I got a lot of votes that say I'm a morning person.
Exactly.
It's like starting to shift this belief. But I think ultimately the point that you were getting to, I agree with, which is that true behavior change is identity change. Once you shift the way you think about yourself, you're not even really trying to pursue behavior change anymore. You're just acting in alignment with the type of person you already believe yourself to be. And that can work both. So far I've been talking about habits as a method for shifting beliefs, but this is actually a two-way street, right? Like beliefs also inform your next action. Once you believe something like, I'm not a morning person, you have a reason for staying in bed. And like all aspects associated with habits, this can either work for you or against you. You can have negative beliefs like I have a sweet tooth, or I'm bad at math, or I'm terrible with directions. Or you can have positive beliefs like I'm a fit person, or I'm the type of person who doesn't miss workouts, or, I am consistent and right every day, or I'm reliable. I'm a good team player. Like all of those beliefs influence how you perform in the next circumstance. And so the point that I'm getting to is when we try to use beliefs to change behavior, when we try to just say, think differently, that's where you get like fake it till you make it. And sometimes it can be effective, but almost always it's only effective in the short term. It's very hard for that to be an effective long-term strategy. If you want it to last, then you need to use behavior to change beliefs. You need to work in the other direction, because that's how you accumulate evidence, like waking up early for a year straight. Of being that kind of person, and then the belief changes naturally when you have evidence for it.
Yeah, maybe that already was kind of what you would answer with then, but one follow-up I would have is, how do you make sure this doesn't kind of implode into like just it's kind of the same thing, but kind of like, just the gritting your teeth of, if I can just believe that I'm a workout person, like how do you protect or hedge against soul burnout or mental burnout of just the like, I'm not that person, or do you know what I'm saying? Like kind of that once you actually get into the nitty gritty of the conflict of that, of like, oh, I just need to believe that I am this person, and all of a sudden I'll start working out or whatever. And that's actually one compliment I love about you and love about your work. So much of this stuff comes with an enormous burden. So much stuff on habits, life hacks, etc. comes with just so much weight. And I feel like I read your stuff and it's very free. Like I'm just like, oh, I want to go do this. I'm excited to do this. It's compelling. It's attractive. And it's partly because I think you talk a lot about micro habits, not just like go change the world tomorrow, which I think a lot of us should just concentrate on micro habits. But so that's a compliment to you. But I think also, what would you say when you do get in that, like even people that might read your stuff, but still I think we can get in this like conflict of soul or conflict of mind of, man, I'm trying really hard to believe, but it's not working.
Sure. Yeah. It's easy to feel overwhelmed when you think about all the stuff you have to change. Or sometimes, I agree. I think sometimes the conversations about these topics like they fall very much on the spectrum of like, just try harder. You need more willpower. You need grit, perseverance.
Hmm.
Like, you need to be willing to show up and take responsibility and own your life and that kind of stuff. And it's not that any of those qualities are bad. Certainly, it's wonderful to have perseverance and willpower and grit and so on. But what I think is misguided is the way in which we do that. And so my approach is a little bit more focused on designing a system where it is easy to do those things rather than asking yourself to do something that overpowers the system. So I'll give two practical answers to the question you just asked. But before I do, I want to share this little like metaphor or analogy that I use, which is imagine that you have like a garden hose and there's a bend in the middle of it. And you have a little bit of water trickling out of the hose. And that water represents your productivity or your habits or your effectiveness. And if you want to get more water coming out of the hose, if you want to be more successful, more productive, more effective, you have two options. The first option is you could either crank up the valve on the hose and just force more water through. The second option is you can simply remove the bend in the hose and let water flow through naturally. And talking about having more grit, willpower, perseverance, etc., is kind of like cranking up the valve on the hose. It'll work, but it's tough because it increases tension in the system and it
It
increases
taxes
the
the
amount of
system. Yeah.
friction that you have to overcome. But removing the bend in the hose gets you the same result, but it reduces tension in the system and reduces the amount of friction that you face. And so I think early on in this conversation, we talked about the importance of designing a system for change, about focusing on the system rather than the goal. And this is where I think all of this comes together, and kind of one of the main purposes of Atomic Habits and like why I wrote it the way I did, which is we believe that the system is what we need to get results. The idea is to become the type of person you want to become, to develop the identity you want to develop, rather than to get a particular outcome or to make that the focus and to let the outcomes come naturally. And the way to do that is to design a system where the habits that reinforce your desired identity and naturally lead to those outcomes are easy to perform. And so this is where I get to the practical application that I mentioned. So one thing you can do is what I call environment design. And environment design essentially allows you to achieve this like instant willpower boost without having to fight your environment. A lot of the time when people feel like they want to build a new habit, they feel like they got to overpower things, like the people in my office culture are holding me back from sticking to this diet, or I'm trying to not watch as much TV, but I feel like I just get sucked into it every time I walk into the living room or whatever. And what you find is that the environments that we're in often prompt certain behaviors. And if you can restructure that environment, you can make it much easier to stick with good habits and to break bad ones. So for example, the television option I just mentioned. A lot of people feel like they spend too much time watching Netflix or whatever. Well, if you walk into pretty much any living room, where do all the couches and chairs face? Like
Yeah,
they
they've
all
created
face the
almost
TV.
like a focal point of this is the
Yeah, it's like
thing.
a tunnel, like this is the one thing this room is designed to get you to do. So there are a variety of options that you can take here, right? You could take a chair and turn it away from the TV rather than facing it. You could take the remote control and take it off the coffee table and put it inside a drawer so you're less likely to see it. You could put the television inside a wall unit or a cabinet so it's behind some doors and less obvious. You could take the video game controller or the console and put that in a drawer so it's not out in the middle of the living room floor prompting you to play. And that all just reduces visibility of the cues that prompt your bad habits. But you could also increase the friction associated with the undesired task. So like you could take the batteries in the remote control and take them out. And then each time you want to turn it on, you have to put them back in. It takes an extra like 5 or 10 seconds. And maybe that's enough time for you to be like, do I really want to watch this, or am I just turning it on mindlessly? Or you could unplug the TV after each use and then only plug it back in if you can say the name of the show that you want to watch, right? So like you're not allowed to just turn Netflix on and find something. You can't just channel surf or whatever. If you really wanted to be extreme about it, you could take the TV off the wall, put it in the closet, and only set it up when you want to watch something bad enough to set it back up again. I had one reader who, her and her husband they decided that they were watching too many sports events. And so they were like, we're just going to get rid of our TV. And if we don't want to watch the game enough to drive 10 minutes down the road and go to the sports bar to watch it, that we don't actually want to watch it. And, there are varying levels of extremity here, but the point of environment design is twofold. One, it makes the cues of your good habits more obvious and the cues of your bad habits less obvious. And two, it increases the friction associated with doing the undesired task, and it reduces the friction of doing the good habits. So it puts more steps between you and the bad habits and fewer steps between you and the good ones. And you can imagine that any one of these changes is not going to transform your life. But if you have if you live or work in an environment where there are 100 little choices like that are all kind of nudging you toward the right answer and away from the wrong one, suddenly having willpower and grit and perseverance becomes much easier. And this is actually what a variety of studies show on self-control, which is that the people who have the highest degree of self-control are not those who have like superhuman willpower, but actually are just those people who are tempted the least. And so this is the idea that you're trying to build an environment where you're tempted less, and you'll instantly find that your willpower increases.
That's good. And your garden hose analogy is awesome. And it reminds me of and another reason I connected with you when I was reading your book, I think it was the intro, actually, not even the main part of the book, where you talk about playing baseball and the face injury, which was gnarly. Oh my goodness. It was an awesome story. I was like, man, you should put that in the first chapter. That was gripping. But yeah, you talk about, I loved how you talked about you playing baseball, because same here, I played baseball all the way through college, and played my whole life. So, you're going 17, 18 years at that point once you play from like 3 or 4 all the way through college. And yeah, that's such a great place to learn about habits and training and coaching, et cetera. But it's not like, it's just kind of, you just do the work, I think. But what I loved what you talked about is it was only a couple sentences, but you basically talked about how you didn't like end up going to play in the major leagues, but you were satisfied and content because you feel like when you graduated college, because of the habits you had formed, you reached kind of your full potential. You kind of reached the level at which you were content with. And I think that was really profound. I think a lot of times we want habits and we want rituals to create us to be someone we're not, or to give us someone else's lifestyle, right? To make $1 million in 2 minutes and this and that, et cetera. When in reality, it's like, no, I think a lot of times it's just that garden hose analogy of, man, there's just a lot more awesomeness in you, and your garden hose is bent, and you can actually take a lot of satisfaction once you just unbend the garden hose of yourself and live in like your fullness, right? And so I thought that was really, really good. Let's talk about one question I had for you, which I thought would be really interesting, and I'd love to hear if you've thought about this or not, is habit forming in the context of virtue. And what I mean by that is, again, there's some work, N.T. Wright, scholar, professor, has done some work here as well, where a lot of times with things like love and generosity and kindness, kind of like character formation rather than just behavior, things that are external. He kind of argues like we think that just some people are kind, some people aren't, some people have it, some people don't, etc. But he kind of makes the argument again that like that is actually at its core, virtue is a habit. Like love is a habit, kindness is a habit, generosity is a habit, where you kind of have to just, courage is a habit, right? He uses the example of, the Sully pilot, that landed in the Hudson. And he basically said the reason he was able to make all these split-second decisions and basically save everyone is because he had the habit of just like 30 years of flights and crisis and hard moments, etc. So the virtue of courage was habitual at that point, right? He didn't freak out. He was great under pressure. And so that's kind of the virtue, is like when you get put under pressure, what comes out? And I think our true habits come out. So I don't know if you've thought about that at all, but like how would you say maybe habits with that? Or a question that I think it begs is, this is the one place I think where the feedback loop isn't as strong. And what I mean by that is like you create good habits because you'll do a good habit and then you get a reward. But if you're generous or you're kind, sometimes that person is not giving you the feedback loop you want, right? So then what do you kind of do when maybe the feedback loop breaks? And I think maybe that would apply in that virtue thing, or if you have any thoughts there.
Yeah, there's quite a few things to unpack there. So first, this idea that virtue is a habit, or kindness, gratitude, generosity, so on, is a habit. I think that that's definitely true. How else our actions are, there's this weird thing that happens where for you as an individual, you know yourself both by your thoughts and your actions.
Yeah.
But everyone else in the world who ever interacts with you knows you only by your actions and not by your thoughts. They cannot be inside your head. And so you can consider yourself a kind or generous or grateful person, in your thoughts. But if you don't express that through your habits, through your actions, then other people never have a chance to consider those virtues as associated with you as well. So then we can kind of run down this rabbit hole of like, well, are you a kind or virtuous person if you believe it, but other people don't, and so on.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
my point here is that your habits are how you express a particular virtue. They're how you live it out. And so if you want others to view you as kind and virtuous and grateful and so on, the only method that they have for seeing those things through you is by your actions. They cannot be inside your head. And so in that sense, yes, I think virtue has to be expressed by habit. The second piece that you brought up is kind of this idea of like, did you, well, sorry, go
Like
ahead.
when the
Refresh me.
basically
Where
when the feedback loop breaks, because and I don't even think this is just in virtue. I think this is anything. I think habits with person to environment, you are kind of lording over the environment. They usually give you the result you want. Person to person habits, any type of habits that involve relationships, or maybe even just in marriage or whatever it is. Sometimes that feedback loop can break. It's not as one-to-one. Does that make sense? So just what do you do there if like the habit's not being reinforced by other people?
Yeah. So there's kind of like there's an initial response and there's like a higher level response.
Yeah.
So the initial response is often the habits that we perform, the reward or the outcome, the way that we judge the effectiveness of that behavior is based on what it delivers externally. So how the other person responds in conversation, whether the habit gets you the external result that you want, and so on. And what you find is that when the external feedback is positive, especially if it's instant, if it's like very immediate, if the immediate feedback is positive, we want to repeat a particular habit. And this is something that in the book I refer to as the cardinal rule of behavior change, which is behaviors that are immediately rewarded get repeated, behaviors that are immediately punished get avoided. And we're doing this all the time. Like if you're in conversation and you say something that isn't politically correct or doesn't land the right way with the other person, you see that their feedback is different, and then you update and adjust or like backtrack or whatever. Like you're constantly taking in that external feedback. And so that loop is going on all the time. But then the higher level response is the ultimate form of immediate satisfaction is a reinforcement of your desired identity. That by doing this thing or saying this particular thing, you know that you are being the kind of person you want to be. And this is when you see people act courageous or say something and stand up for their beliefs or remain principled and stand by their values in the face of opposition. They're not doing it because the immediate feedback externally is positive. It's not. They're being pushed back. There's pushback from the person they're talking to or from the group that they're addressing. But they're able to maintain that or stick to that performance and behavior because the internal feedback is reinforcing their desired identity. Now, like anything, like all things associated with habits, this can work for you or against you, right? Like sometimes if we see someone who has the opposite belief as us and they're doubling down, that in their mind, they're reinforcing their desired identity. They're maintaining their values and principles. Those values and principles don't happen to match up with yours. Yeah. And so you see this and you think they're acting crazy or they're completely off base or so on. They're the enemy, whatever. But that's what's happening. There can be an internal reinforcement when there isn't an external one. And of course, where we all want to get to is to have a more accurate and useful view of the world, a more accurate and useful worldview where the external results and the internal reinforcement are matching up so that we're acting in alignment and we're getting the positive feedback that we want.
That's good. I love that. Yeah. It's like sometimes when you're loving to your spouse, and they're not responding well or whatever, it's the act of love that actually does give you the feedback that you feel fulfilled in and that kind of reinforces that identity. And I think is helpful and sometimes not just getting caught in the game of like, oh, the feedback loop wasn't good, so then I changed. Because there is things I think you still need to do when the feedback loop isn't good. And there's some things where the feedback loop is really great because you're like, oh, I shouldn't do that. So it kind of goes both ways.
I should say too, that whole process I think is, I don't know any other way to get through that and update that than through experience.
Yes.
Like the more that you have those kind of conversations with your spouse, or the more that you talk about your principles and values, or the more that you exercise acts of generosity and kindness and virtue and so on, even when the other person isn't appreciative of it, as your experience increases in those fields, you develop it's kind of like, oh, I've seen this before.
Yeah.
And so you have a new way of responding to that. Whereas early on, the truth is you don't have a lot of experience with it. And so you're trying to learn on the fly, and you get negative feedback and you think, oh, I must have been wrong. But as the body of experience increases, you come to discern and realize when negative feedback is constructive and useful, and when it's just that person's not responding in the way that they must be interpreting this in a different way. I need to stay principled and maintain what I'm doing.
Totally. That's really good. That's really good. Let's talk about one last thing, and then I got like two or three fun questions we like to end on. I think this is, again, in the beginning of the book, guys, you need to get the book Atomic Habits. I can't recommend it enough. I think I'm on pace to read about 120 books this year. I try to read 2 a week. That's my goal, or my formation. Well, it's funny. You just love reading, and you start reading, and then all of a sudden you realize at the end of the year you read that many books, even though you didn't set a goal. It's just funny how that works. But I probably will put this one in my top 5 or top 10. It's really, it's just brilliant, and I think you distilled so well. You really made it. Like, this is a full package deal. Talks about everything, holds everything. So guys, please go check it out. Go to Amazon right now. Quit the podcast. Don't finish it. Get the book, then come back and finish it. But I think in the beginning you talked about, I love the concept. And again, it gets back to this. I think you depressurize and deburden habits so well. And I think one place you do that well is with the kind of the 1% thing, right? Like, and you talk about it with the language of kind of compound interest. 1% better each day or 1% worse each day, et cetera. And to me, I read that and I'm like, oh, I can do that. And I can do that actually in a million ways pretty easily. What I can't do is just like, make a goal and change my life tomorrow, which again, that's what the internet sometimes screams at us. And so, 1%, like not even 10%. I feel like you could even go there, and but you're like 1% better each day is like, man, if you're whatever you want to be is a cleaner house or a more organized house, 1% is like literally taking a pillow off the ground, putting it on the couch, and like, boom, okay, that's 1% better today. And so I just feel like, talk about that maybe. And I love, guys, you have to get the book just for the graph. The graph alone almost speaks better than words. You're like, man, that's a hockey stick on the top, and then you go down to 0 on the bottom. But yeah, maybe talk about that for a second.
So I like to refer to habits as the compound interest of self-improvement. And the reason that I use that phrase is that the same way that money multiplies through compound interest, the effects of your habits multiply as you repeat them across time. So you can sort of think of like time magnifies the margin between success and failure, between doing something 1% better or 1% worse. So if you have good habits, if you have this commitment to doing things just a slightly better, 1% better each day, all you need is time to get the results that you want. Time. Good habits make time your ally, but bad habits make time your enemy. And so it's really about like, what kind of leverage do you have in that small way? And the way that I think about this is there are a variety of ways of cutting it. So first, there's mathematically, you mentioned this graph. If you are to get 1% better each day, so 1.01 to the 365th power, you'll end up 37 times better at the end of the year. So it's like this, it's this very crazy hockey stick kind of curve, right? And if you get 1% worse each day, you drive yourself all the way almost down to 0. And as you said, getting 1% better doesn't feel like much on any given day. And this is kind of one of the key insights of any compounding process. If you look at that graph, in the beginning, there's almost nothing there, right? It's like just shallow. It's like this plateau. You don't really have much to show for it. Same thing is true with actual compound interest, right? If you're saving for retirement, those early years, it doesn't really feel like you're making a whole lot of progress. You're socking money away. Yeah, but
that's why people don't do it, because there's no,
you still can't retire.
Yeah, it doesn't come back to you.
It's not until decades later, 10, 20 years, 30 years later, where it really starts to take off and you get all this growth in your portfolio. Well, habits are kind of the same way, right? Like, what's the difference between studying Spanish for an hour tonight or not studying at all? Not a whole lot. Like, you haven't learned the language either way. But by studying for an hour each night, you turn around 5 years later and now you know the language. So it's again, the outcomes are delayed. Same way with like, what's the difference between eating a salad for lunch or having a burger and fries? On any
Nothing.
given day,
On that
not
day.
much. Your
On that
body
day.
looks the same. The scale is basically the same. But in the long run, 2 or 5 or 10 years from now, there's a very big difference. And so that I think is the kind of the insight is that habits can compound for you or against you. On any given day, it's very easy to overlook the effect of that choice that's 1% better or 1% worse. But if you can embrace a philosophy of just getting 1% better, of finding some small margin for improvement, then you'll turn around a decade from now and have very different results because of it.
Yeah, and I love that because I think, again, I'm 29, my wife's 31, and I think a lot of people listening are right about in that range with us. And I think the millennial curse per se can be we just want things so quick and we want the feedback to be so instant. And I think social media has created that, whatever it is. But yeah, I just think we have to remind ourselves, it's back to that 80-year-old thing again of like, who do you want to be when you're 80? What kind of house do you want to have when you're 80 in the sense of not just like, physical structure, but I mean, like, what do you want your home to be like? What do you want your work to be like? How fulfilled do you want to be? And then work backwards to those micro habits. And you will get there. Like you will, and you probably will get there at 40, because it compounds quicker than you think over a couple decades, and we want it in 2 days. So let's end with a couple fun questions we like to ask our guests who are on the podcast. The first one is a fun one. I'm interested to hear what you say, I think, because it kind of maybe relates, is if there were 26 hours in a day, what would you do more of?
Reading. I'd probably do more reading.
We are the same.
The thing about reading is that it's a meta habit that can solve any other habit or problem you're facing, right? Like if you want to launch a podcast, you can read a book about it. If you want to learn how to meditate, you can read a book about it. If you want to figure out how to get your finances in order and pay off debt, you can read a book about it. Like pick any topic you want. Reading can help you solve that problem. And so by having more time to read, in theory, at least, I could make more effective decisions and live a more useful or helpful lifestyle.
That's so good. I like to say that reading is the gateway drug to life, like just meaning and fullness and experience and story and narrative and empathy and everything. Like you and Sam, that's one of the main reasons we even are homeschool and unschool family is because I think public schools sometimes can't get reading's treated as a subject rather than the gateway drug. And I think, man, you start there and you can go everywhere. It's unlimited. Another one is, this is a fun one. And if you can't think of three, you can just think of one or two, but what are the top 3 things that you would say you're loving right now that are free?
Okay. Well, one thing I'm loving that is completely free and anybody can do it is I leave my phone in another room until lunch each day. So
Yeah,
I'm loving that
you can't
action.
write without doing that.
It's huge. It's like it's a really nice way to start the day by not being interrupted. Now, it doesn't work for everybody's job, right? Some jobs are literally based around the phone. But for many people, I think you could get away with like a 3-hour block in the morning where you don't have your phone in the same room. And man, the level of effectiveness is significant. Another thing that I'm loving is called, I'll give 2 as one. They're Chrome extensions. They're free. You can just add them to your web browser. And one is called Facebook Newsfeed Eradicator. And so you can log into Facebook, but it blocks the newsfeed. So you don't see any links or updates or whatever. If you want to go to your friend's profile, you can do that. If you want to post something to your page, you can do that, but you just don't see the newsfeed. So that saves a lot of time. And then the other one is called Distraction Free YouTube. And so it's a Chrome extension that allows you to watch YouTube, but it blocks the suggested video feed in the sidebar. So you don't see any other videos to click on. So you just watch the one you come for and don't get into a spiral of watching like 30 more. So both of those are free. And then let's see.
What's a fun thing? Maybe it's, your mom's cooking. I mean, it's not free for her, but for you, or it's, something that you walk by every day, or a park or a podcast or anything in that realm that you like.
So this is totally free that my wife and I have been doing for a while now, but we, I'll give you 2 more. So one is we say one thing we're grateful for that happened in the last 24 hours before dinner each night. And that is such an interesting habit because one, there's always something, which is like kind of surprising. You just in itself, you'd think maybe there'd be one day where there wasn't something. Yeah. And 2, they almost are never things that cost money. Which is also like kind of insightful because we spend all this time buying stuff and thinking about what we want to buy and what we want to get. And like almost nothing in that category makes it onto the list each night, which is interesting. So that's one. And then the second thing that is free that we are doing, which I think is kind of cool, is she picked 3 books that she loved that she thinks I should read, and I picked 3 that I think she should read. And so we're kind of doing this like shared.
Do you guys
reading
read pretty
forever.
far spread apart on genre? So is that an interesting?
Completely different. I read like almost exclusively nonfiction. She reads almost exclusively fiction.
Same with us.
So yeah, it's an interesting experiment, but it's good.
I do feel like that's harder for her though, because I feel like like fiction, anyone can kind of get wrapped up in, even if it's not really like what you're about. But I think if you're a fiction person going all into nonfiction, that can be a little like sluggish.
Yeah, right. I'm giving her like fundamentals of accounting, and she's giving me like some interesting novel to read.
Oh,
yeah,
dude, that's good. That is funny. That's a good. Me and my wife might have to do that because she's a big fiction person, and I'm usually just reading like kind of what the newest books are, nonfiction, journalist books, stuff like that. That's funny. You might have been my favorite person so far on what are top 3 things that are free. Those are really good, and I love the Chrome extensions too. I'm like stuck in the 1980s with Safari. Mainly, when you ever get stuck in an ecosystem and you're just like, man, I Chrome is way better, but I just don't want to make the leap and have to struggle for like 6 days. So I'm like, I hate Safari, but I'm stuck. But I might have to go for those. Okay, and then the last question, and this one's funny because we asked our guest this one, but I feel like it's right up your alley. But we use the word ritual, but I feel like we could change habit. It says, what is a daily or weekly ritual that is giving you life or joy right now or meaning? So we try to lean this question a little bit more towards meaning. Like what's a ritual? And you kind of alluded to a small one with the thankfulness. That would have been a perfect one. What's a daily or weekly ritual that's kind of giving your life joy or meaning or depth right now?
Oh man, I have 2. So one is weightlifting. I could not be. The thing that's interesting is exercise often sounds like it's a very personal thing, but it provides a bunch of other benefits for me. Like one, it's social. A lot of our friends are at the gym. We meet people in our community and neighborhood. 2, it facilitates my ability to do everything else that I do. I don't think that I would be able to be an entrepreneur if I didn't have that hour to gym each night. Like I wouldn't, there's so many days when you're like, business is stuck. I didn't get anything done today. I wasn't productive, but at least I had a good workout. And like that makes it so much easier to show up the next day and give your best again. So weight training is one. And then the second is writing. I mean, it's the backbone of my business, but it's probably the single biggest thing that gives me meaning in my work. And I guess I should specifically say not writing itself, but sharing my writing publicly. I can remember moments early on, like my business wasn't making any money. I didn't have a big audience or anything, but I would write an article and I'd get like 1 email a week from a reader who said, I really enjoyed this, or this meant a lot to me, or this was helpful for the following reasons. And that 1 email was enough to get me to show up the next week and do it all over again. And so writing and weightlifting are probably the 2 that provide the most meaning for me.
That's really good. And that's a note to everyone listening too. And I'm not saying this to come tell it to me and Alyssa or even to James, but there's a lot of people that have probably impacted you online. And we're so quick to throw out the things we dislike. There's almost like, I think there's data on this where we don't respond or comment on things unless it's like what we disagree with. Right? Like, or it's like controversial, but it's like, man.
I think about like, am I going to leave a review on Amazon? If I really like a book, I probably won't say anything. If it's like terrible and it's a 1-star experience, that's when you call customer service or like, you only complain when it's so bad that you feel like you need to say something.
But I think that's a habit
you love. These people who are giving you a lot every day.
Yes.
We just don't think of it. And I'm as guilty of it as anybody else. But
totally. But I think that's a habit we can all cultivate more as man. There's a lot of people that you probably enjoy online that have blessed you, that have fed you or encouraged you or just lifted you up in a little bit of way. And I think just literally, whether it's a tweet, it's a DM, even if you think they have millions of followers, usually they see it or it's an email. And yeah, a little bit more personal, a little bit longer with a story. If you have been impacted by someone in that way, I think reach out. It really makes people's days. Okay, well, that's it. I'd love to hear, feel free to tell people a little bit like where they can find you, specifically the book. I mean, you did us a huge service. I don't like when podcasts kind of make the people feel like, we're doing you a service by coming onto our podcast. Anytime someone comes on a podcast, they're doing that podcast a service by offering their expertise and their time and their entire life experience. So we're honored and humbled and grateful that you came on. So totally tell everyone how they can support you, what they can do, etc.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, it's been great to talk to you. If people want to check out my writing and work, you can just go to jamesclear.com. You can click on articles. I've got them organized by category and topics. Poke around, see what's interesting to you. And if you'd like to learn more about the book, it's called Atomic Habits, and you can grab it at atomichabits.com. And in addition to the book, There are a couple bonus materials that are available on the site. Like there's a guide on how to apply the ideas to parenting, on how to apply the ideas to business, habit trackers for tracking your habits, and a variety of other like little bonus materials and worksheets and so on. But anyway, all of that is at atomichabits.com.
Awesome. And guys, make sure to sign up for his newsletter. I think you might be one of the only people where I actually open the emails they send me because it's so rich, it's so full of depth, and it makes me think usually for the rest of the day. So, hey, thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you so much.